Rome, around 62 AD. There is a man sitting in a rented room, writing a letter. He is not writing from a palace or a throne room or any place that history tends to remember. The room is small. A Roman soldier stands outside the door. Not because the man is dangerous in any way that Rome understands danger, but because he is technically a prisoner waiting for his case to be heard by the emperor. He has been waiting for 2 years. His name is Paul, and he has just received word that the community he spent 2 years of his life building in Corinth is falling apart. Again, he picks up his pen. This is what Paul does when he cannot go somewhere he needs to be. He writes. And the strange, almost impossible thing about that habit is that the letters he wrote when he was stuck, when he was imprisoned, when he was too far away to help, when all he had was words, and the hope that those words would arrive in time and that someone would read them and understand, those letters are what survived him. They are sitting in the New Testament right now. They have been read out loud in churches every Sunday for nearly 2,000 years, in over 100 countries, in hundreds of languages, by billions of people who have never heard of Tarsus or Antioch or Galatia. So here is the question this story is going to answer. How does that happen? How does a man who started out trying to destroy the Jesus movement end up becoming the voice that carried it across the Roman world? Who was he, really, underneath the theology and the stained glass and the feast days? What kind of person goes through what he went through and keeps going? That is the man we are looking for. And to find him, we have to start not with a vision on a road, but with the world that made him. Chapter 1. Tarsus, the man nobody saw coming. To understand Paul, you have to understand the world he was born into. And that world is nothing like what most people picture when they think about the first century. Tarsus was not a village. It was not a quiet backwater on the edge of the Roman Empire. It was a major city, one of the great intellectual centers of the Mediterranean world. Sitting at the crossroads of 3 civilizations at once, trade routes from the east and the west ran through it. Greek philosophy was taught in its schools. Roman law governed its streets. And inside all of that, there was a thriving Jewish community that had been living in the diaspora for generations, holding on to its identity in the middle of a world that had very different ideas about how life was supposed to work. This is where Saul was born, sometime in the early years of the 1st century, in a city that was simultaneously Jewish, Greek, and Roman. A boy came into the world, already carrying 3 different ways of understanding everything. His family was Jewish in the most serious possible sense. They were not the kind of diaspora Jews who had gradually blended into the surrounding culture, who spoke Greek at home and remembered the Torah mostly on holidays. They were Pharisees, from the tribe of Benjamin, which is about as Jewish as a Jewish family in the 1st century could be. The tribe of Benjamin was the tribe of Israel's first king. The Pharisees were the group most committed to living out every detail of Torah in daily life, not as a burden, but as a way of aligning themselves with what they believed was the actual structure of reality. Saul would later describe himself as a Hebrew of Hebrews. He meant it as a statement of identity, not just ancestry. This was who he was at the core. At the same time, his family held Roman citizenship. This is worth pausing on, because it was not a small thing. Roman citizenship was a privilege that the vast majority of people living in the empire, including most Jews, did not have. It came with legal protections, with rights, with a different relationship to the power structure of the Roman world. How Saul's family obtained citizenship is not recorded, but the fact that they had it shaped everything about his life, in ways that would not become fully clear until much later. And then there was Tarsus itself. Greek was the language of the city, the language of commerce and philosophy and public life. Saul grew up breathing it. He would later write in Greek with a fluency and a rhetorical sophistication that only comes from someone who had been living inside the language since childhood. He knew the Stoic philosophers. He knew how Greek audiences thought and argued, and what kind of reasoning they found persuasive. He did not have to learn to think in multiple frameworks when he got older. He had been doing it since he was old enough to walk through the markets of Tarsus and hear 3 languages in an afternoon. 3 worlds, held together in one person. Jewish in his bones, Roman by legal status, Greek by language and culture and intellectual formation. Most people in the first century were one thing. Saul of Tarsus was 3 things simultaneously, and he had never known it to be any other way. At some point in his teenage years, he was sent to Jerusalem to study. His teacher was Gamaliel, one of the most respected rabbis of the era. This was not a casual education. Studying with Gamaliel meant entering one of the most serious intellectual traditions of the ancient world. The tradition of careful, rigorous, line-by-line engagement with the Torah and with the centuries of interpretation that had accumulated around it. Saul was not just learning religious rules. He was learning a way of reading the world. Torah was not, for a Pharisee, a collection of regulations imposed from above. It was the blueprint of creation. Every commandment, every detail of Sabbath observance and dietary law and ritual practice, was a way of living in alignment with the order that God had built into the universe. This was a beautiful and demanding vision, and Saul gave himself to it completely. By the time he was a young man, he was, by his own later account, advancing beyond many of his contemporaries in his commitment to his ancestral traditions. He was not a moderate. He was not someone who held his convictions loosely. He believed what he believed with his whole self, and he lived accordingly. Jerusalem in those years was a city under pressure from every direction. Roman occupation was a constant, grinding reality. Different Jewish groups, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, disagreed sharply about how to respond to that reality and what faithfulness to God actually required. Into this already complicated world, a new movement had appeared, one that was attracting followers from within the Jewish community. Built around the memory and the claimed resurrection of a rabbi from Galilee named Jesus of Nazareth. Saul watched this movement the way a man watches something he has identified as a threat. He did not see it as harmless enthusiasm. He did not see it as an interesting theological variation. He saw it as a direct attack on the most important things he believed. These people were going around Jerusalem claiming that a man who had been executed by Rome, crucified on a cross, was the Messiah of Israel, the Anointed One, the one through whom God would restore his people. But in Deuteronomy, the text that every Pharisee knew by heart, a person hung on a tree was under the curse of God. A crucified man was not a candidate for Messiah. He was a demonstration that God had rejected him. This was not, for Saul, an abstract doctrinal disagreement. If this movement was right, then everything he had built his life around was wrong. And if it was wrong, it was not just mistaken. It was dangerous. It was leading people away from God while claiming to lead them toward Him. It was corrupting Israel from the inside at the exact moment when Israel needed to be most faithful. He made a decision, and the decision he made tells you everything you need to know about what kind of person Saul of Tarsus was before Damascus. He was the kind of person who, when he identified something as wrong, did not write a strongly worded letter. He acted. Chapter 2. The Persecutor. What he was protecting. There is a moment in the book of Acts that most people move past too quickly. Stephen is standing before the Jewish council in Jerusalem, making the longest speech recorded in the entire book of Acts. A sweeping argument that the history of Israel had been leading toward Jesus all along. The crowd does not receive this well. They drag him outside the city and they stone him to death. And while this is happening, a young man named Saul is standing nearby, watching, holding the coats of the men doing the killing. He is not throwing stones. But Acts is careful to tell us that he approved of the execution. He was there. He witnessed it. And he had no problem with what he saw. This is where most tellings of Paul's story begin to treat him as a villain in a movie. The bad guy who will eventually come around. But that framing misses something important. Something that actually makes the story far more interesting and far more unsettling. Saul was not a villain. He was not a cruel man who enjoyed causing suffering. He was something much more difficult to dismiss than that. He was a man of deep conviction, acting on that conviction with complete consistency. Think about what that means in practice. Saul had a framework for understanding the world. One he had spent years studying and sharpening. One he believed was not just his personal opinion, but was grounded in the actual Word of God. Inside that framework, the Jesus movement was not a harmless new religion. It was a corruption spreading through the body of Israel at the worst possible moment. And a man who believes that, who genuinely believes it, does not sit quietly and hope the problem goes away on its own. He does something about it. So Saul did something about it. Acts describes him going house to house in Jerusalem, dragging out men and women alike, and throwing them into prison. The detail about women is important. This was not targeted enforcement against specific leaders. This was a systematic campaign to uproot the movement wherever it was taking hold. He was not acting out of personal hatred for the people he was arresting. He almost certainly believed he was doing them a service, preventing them from leading others further into what he saw as a dangerous deception. The Greek word Acts uses to describe his activity is the same word used for wild animals attacking their prey. He was ravaging the church. Those are not the words of a passive bystander. This was a man who had decided that a problem required decisive action, and who had the will and the resources to provide it. He received authority from the high priest to extend his campaign beyond Jerusalem, to travel to Damascus and identify followers of the way there, and to bring them back to Jerusalem in chains. He was not a local enforcer anymore. He had become the leading edge of an organized effort to stop this movement before it spread further. And here is the thing that is easy to miss when you know how the story ends. On the day Saul set out for Damascus, he had no doubts. He was not wrestling with uncertainty in the back of his mind, secretly wondering if maybe these people had a point. He was not the conflicted villain of a Hollywood drama who is already halfway to his conversion before the plot requires it. He was a man who had looked at the evidence, had applied everything he knew about Torah and theology and the history of Israel, and had reached a conclusion he was prepared to act on at considerable personal cost. That kind of certainty is worth taking seriously. It does not make what he did right. Nothing about holding the coats of a man being stoned to death was right. But it makes him real. And understanding what he actually was before Damascus is the only way to understand why Damascus shattered him the way it did. There is a psychological reality about conviction that most of us understand from the inside, even if we rarely talk about it. When you believe something completely, when your belief is not just intellectual, but is woven into your identity, your community, your daily practice, your entire understanding of who you are and why your life matters. You do not experience it as one opinion among many. You experience it as the truth. And people acting from the truth, from their deepest truth, are capable of things that people acting from ordinary selfishness or cruelty are not capable of. Because they have a clean conscience, because every action they take, however harmful it looks from the outside, makes sense inside the framework that is organizing their entire world. Saul's framework was not irrational. It was built on centuries of serious theological thought. The God of Israel had chosen a specific people, given them a specific covenant, and laid out in extraordinary detail what faithfulness to that covenant required. The Messiah, when he came, would be a figure of divine vindication, a king who would restore Israel's dignity and fulfill the ancient promises. He would not be a man executed as a criminal by the occupying empire. He would not be someone whose followers were teaching that the Torah had been somehow superseded or reinterpreted beyond recognition. Everything about the Jesus movement, from Saul's perspective, was pointing in the wrong direction. He was protecting something, not just a religious institution, not just his own status within the Pharisaic community, but something he believed was genuinely sacred and genuinely at risk. The integrity of Israel's relationship with God, the coherence of the covenant, the truth that he had organized his entire life around. This matters because the person who arrives at Damascus is not someone who has been secretly doubting. He is someone whose certainty is absolute. And absolute certainty, when it breaks, does not break gently. The early community of Jesus followers that Saul was targeting is also worth understanding more clearly, because they are easy to misread through the lens of later history. These were not Christians in any modern sense of the word. They were Jews. They continued to attend the temple. They observed Torah. They saw themselves not as the founders of a new religion, but as Jews who had witnessed or heard about something extraordinary, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, and who believed that this event was the beginning of what God had always promised to do for Israel. They were not trying to create a separate religion. They were trying to understand what had happened and what it meant, inside the framework of the tradition they had always lived within. The questions they were wrestling with were Jewish questions, asked in Jewish categories, debated in Jewish terms. The split between Judaism and Christianity as two distinct religions is a later development, one that happened gradually over decades and was not yet visible on the horizon in the years when Saul was walking through Jerusalem with letters from the high priest in his hands. He was fighting people he considered family who had, in his judgment, gone badly wrong. That is a different thing from fighting strangers, and it produces a different kind of intensity. By the time he set out for Damascus, Saul had already shaped the early history of the Jesus movement in ways that could not be undone. The execution of Stephen had scattered many of the Jerusalem believers into the surrounding regions, which had the ironic effect of spreading the movement more widely than it might otherwise have gone. His campaign of arrest had pushed people out of Jerusalem and into new cities, new communities, new conversations with new people. He was trying to contain something, and he was, without knowing it, helping to spread it. He would not know this for years. He would not understand the irony of it until long after Damascus, when he was the one doing the spreading himself, and when he looked back at those early years and saw the shape of what had been happening in ways he could not see at the time. On the road to Damascus, he was still certain. He was still the man who had been right about everything that mattered, who was acting on the best understanding he had, who was doing what he believed God required of him. That certainty was about to meet something it had no category for, and nothing in his three worlds, not his Jewish formation, not his Roman citizenship, not his Greek philosophical training, had prepared him for what was waiting on the road ahead. Chapter 3. Damascus, the day the framework broke. He never fully explained it. That is the first thing to understand about what happened on the road to Damascus, and it is the thing that gets lost most often in the retelling. Paul spent the rest of his life preaching and writing and arguing about the implications of that experience. He built an entire theology around it. He traveled thousands of miles because of it. He went to prison because of it. He died because of it. And in all the letters he wrote, in all the arguments he made, in all the years he spent trying to put into words what he believed and why, he described the Damascus experience itself in almost no detail at all. In Galatians, the letter where he is most insistent about the origins of his message, he writes simply that God was pleased to reveal his Son to him. That is it. No light from heaven, no voice calling his name, no falling to the ground, just the compressed, personal language of someone trying to describe something that language was not built to carry. The detailed account most people know. The blinding light. The voice saying, "Saul, Saul, Why are you persecuting me? The 3 days of blindness. The man named Ananias, coming to restore his sight. That account comes from the book of Acts. Acts tells the story 3 times, and each telling has slightly different details. Acts was written decades after Paul's death, by someone who was not present on the road. It is the community's memory of a story that had been told and retold and had gathered weight and texture over the years, the way important stories always do. Neither account is wrong. Exactly. They are different kinds of telling. Paul's own account is the language of someone for whom the experience was so immediate, so interior, so much a part of who he now was, that describing it in narrative terms felt beside the point. Acts is the language of a community that had come to understand this moment as the hinge of their whole story, and told it accordingly. The gap between the two is not a contradiction to be resolved. It is a window into something real about the nature of the experience itself. When something happens to a person that does not fit inside any of the categories they have been using to understand the world, they often cannot describe it directly. They can only point at the edges of it. They can tell you what changed. They can tell you what they did next. They cannot always tell you what it was. What we can say with confidence is what happened after. Saul arrived in Damascus, being led by the hand. The man who had set out from Jerusalem to bring others into custody arrived in the city he was heading for, unable to see, unable to eat, unable to drink. For 3 days he was blind and did not eat or drink anything. 3 days. Sit with that for a moment, not as a supernatural detail in a religious story, but as a human experience. A man who was absolutely certain about everything that mattered, who had organized his entire life around a coherent and demanding framework for understanding God and the world and his own role within it, has encountered something that does not fit inside that framework. And the framework is not bending to accommodate it. The framework is collapsing. Because if Jesus of Nazareth had risen from the dead, if the crucified one was not under God's curse, but was in fact the one God had vindicated, then everything Saul had done in the name of protecting God's truth was not protection. It was attack. Every family he had broken up in Jerusalem, every person he had dragged out of their home, every hour he had spent standing in the cold while someone was stoned to death for believing what he now had reason to think might be true. All of it collapsed into something he did not have words for yet. This is not a story about a man who was convinced by an argument. Arguments Saul could handle. He had been trained to handle arguments. This is a story about a man whose entire way of seeing the world stopped working, all at once, on a road in Syria, and who spent 3 days in the dark trying to figure out what was left of him. The darkness is the most honest part of the story, not because it proves anything about the supernatural, but because it is exactly what you would expect from the inside of that kind of experience. When the thing you were most sure about turns out to be wrong, you do not immediately reorient yourself toward the truth and move on. You lose your footing. You lose your appetite. You sit in whatever room you are in, and you cannot see the way forward because there is no way forward yet. Because the map you had been using is gone, and the new one has not been drawn. 3 days. No food. No water, no sight. Then a man named Ananias comes. Acts tells us that Ananias was a follower of Jesus in Damascus, that he received a vision telling him to go find Saul, and that he was understandably reluctant. Given that Saul's reputation had traveled ahead of him, he went anyway. He found Saul in the house where he had been staying. He placed his hands on him and called him brother, and Saul's sight returned. That word, brother, coming from a man who had every reason to be afraid of Saul, is worth pausing on. The community that Saul had been hunting down was the first community to receive him after the thing that had just happened to him. The people he had been dragging out of their homes were the people who reached out a hand when he could not see. Saul was baptized. He ate something. He spent several days with the disciples in Damascus. And then Paul begins. Not Saul the persecutor, But the person who will spend the next 30 years of his life doing something that would have been incomprehensible to the man who left Jerusalem a few weeks earlier. There is a question that sits at the center of this chapter that the story raises but cannot fully answer. And that is the honest thing to say about it. What actually happened on that road? The question has been asked for 2,000 years by believers and skeptics and scholars and ordinary people trying to make sense of a story that does not resolve neatly into any single explanation. Supernatural vision. Psychological crisis. Something else entirely. The sources do not give us enough to be certain. And anyone who tells you they are certain is telling you more about their own commitments than about the historical record. What the sources do give us is the aftermath. A man who was moving in one direction stopped moving in that direction and started moving in the opposite one. With the same intensity and the same totality that had characterized everything he did before. The certainty did not disappear. It redirected, and the direction it redirected toward was going to change the world in ways that no one standing on that road in Syria, not Saul, not Ananias, not the companions who had been traveling with him, could have begun to imagine. The man who arrived in Damascus being led by the hand would leave it as someone the city's Jewish community found threatening enough that they watched the gates to stop him from escaping. Acts says his former colleagues were plotting to kill him. His companions lowered him in a basket through an opening in the city wall at night so he could get away. The persecutor had become the one being persecuted. He was not finished being formed yet, not by a long way. But the break had happened. The old framework was gone, and in the silence of those 3 days in the dark, something else had begun to take shape. Something that would take years to fully emerge. That would be worked out in deserts and cities and prison cells and stormy sea crossings and arguments with people he loved and arguments with people who wanted him dead. He had encountered something on that road. Whatever it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Chapter 4. Arabia. The years he had to rebuild everything. After Damascus, Paul did not go to Jerusalem. This is one of the most overlooked facts in his entire story. And it matters more than most people realize. He had just experienced something that had reoriented his entire life. The logical next step, if you are trying to join a movement, is to find the people who are leading that movement and introduce yourself. Peter was in Jerusalem. James, the brother of Jesus, was in Jerusalem. The community that had been closest to Jesus during his lifetime was in Jerusalem. If Paul wanted to understand what had happened and what it meant, that is where the answers were. He did not go there. Instead, he went to Arabia. He tells us this himself in Galatians. In the same passage where he is most insistent that his gospel did not come from any human source. He went to Arabia, then returned to Damascus. And only after 3 years did he go up to Jerusalem to meet Peter. 3 years. In a letter where he is making the argument that what he received came directly from God and not from the other apostles. He is careful to establish that he spent 3 years not talking to the other apostles before he talked to them. What was he doing in Arabia? The honest answer is that we do not know. Paul does not say. The sources do not tell us. Arabia, in the 1st century, referred to the region east and south of Damascus, the territory of the Nabatean kingdom, a landscape of desert and trade routes and ancient cities carved into rock. It was not uninhabited. But it was far from Jerusalem, far from the centers of the Jesus movement, far from anyone who could have told Paul what to think about what had happened to him. And that may have been exactly the point. The man who set out from Jerusalem for Damascus had a framework that explained everything. He knew what God required, what faithfulness looked like, what the history of Israel meant, and where it was heading. That framework had been built over a lifetime of study and practice and community and argument. It was not a set of ideas he held at arm's length. It was the structure of his mind, the lens through which everything made sense. Damascus had shattered that lens, and before Paul could see anything clearly again, He had to figure out what he was looking through now. This is not a simple process. It cannot be rushed. You cannot lose the organizing framework of your entire life on a Tuesday and have a new one fully assembled by Friday. The work of rebuilding, of taking what you believed before and holding it up against what you now believe, and figuring out what survives and what does not, and what needs to be understood in an entirely different way. That work takes time. It takes silence. It takes the kind of solitude that is only possible when you are far from the people who know you as the person you used to be. What Paul was working out in those years in Arabia was something that would eventually become the most sophisticated theological system the early Jesus movement produced. But it did not arrive fully formed. It had to be constructed, piece by piece, from the materials he had. And the materials he had were primarily the Hebrew Scriptures, which he knew with extraordinary depth and precision. Read now through the lens of a single, overwhelming conviction that Jesus of Nazareth had risen from the dead and that this fact changed everything. The question was how. It changed everything. But in what direction? What did it mean for the covenant God had made with Israel? What did it mean for the Torah, the law, the 613 commandments that Saul the Pharisee had spent his life honoring? What did it mean for the nations, the Gentiles, the non-Jewish peoples of the world who had always been in the theological framework Saul grew up with? On the outside of the covenant relationship, did the resurrection of Jesus change their situation? And if so, how? And on what terms? These are not abstract academic questions. They are the questions that would define the next 30 years of Paul's life and that would eventually fracture the early church into factions and produce the letters that are sitting in the New Testament right now. Paul did not receive the answers to these questions in a vision on the road to Damascus. He worked them out, slowly, in the desert, alone with the texts he had memorized since childhood, reading them now with eyes that had been broken open by something he could not fully explain. He would later insist, with a vehemence that suggests people had questioned it, that his gospel had not come from any human being. He had not received it from the other apostles. He had not been taught it by the Jerusalem community. It had come through a revelation of Jesus Christ. Whatever Arabia was, it was the place where that revelation was being worked out into something he could speak and write and argue and defend. There is a cost to this kind of solitary formation that does not get talked about enough. Paul was not just doing intellectual work in Arabia. He was also living with what he had done before Damascus. The families he had separated, the people he had imprisoned, Stephen, whose execution he had approved, whose coats had been placed in his hands while the stones flew. These were not abstract debits in a moral ledger. They were real people, real harm, real consequences that could not be undone. He would write later in his life about a thorn in his flesh that he had prayed to have removed and that had not been removed. Scholars have debated for centuries what he meant. Some think it was a physical illness. Some think it was a specific opponent who caused him grief. But there is a reading of that image that locates the thorn, not in his body or his circumstances, but in his memory. A man who did what Saul did before Damascus, and who then came to believe that he had been profoundly and catastrophically wrong, carries something that does not go away. It becomes part of the texture of everything he does afterward. It does not paralyze him, but it does not leave him either. After 3 years, he went to Jerusalem. He did not go to be educated by the apostles. He goes, as he puts it, to visit Peter, and he stayed with him 15 days. He saw no other apostle except James, the brother of Jesus. 15 days with Peter. That is it. 2 weeks with the man who had known Jesus personally, who had walked with him, who had been in the room when things happened that Paul had only encountered as stories or as the claims of people he had been trying to arrest. What did they talk about for 15 days? The sources do not tell us, but it is not hard to imagine. 2 men who had arrived at the same conviction by completely different routes, sitting in a room in Jerusalem, comparing notes on what they believed had happened and what it meant and what they were supposed to do about it. Peter, with the memories of a man he had watched die. Paul, with the experience of a road in Syria and 3 years of working out the implications in a desert. They were not the same person. They did not see everything the same way. The differences between them would eventually become one of the central dramas of the early church. But for 15 days in Jerusalem, they were just two men trying to understand the same enormous thing. Paul left Jerusalem and went to the regions of Syria and Cilicia. He was not yet the figure that history would remember. He was still being formed, still unknown to most of the communities that had heard his name only as the name of a persecutor. He writes that the churches in Judea had heard that the man who formerly persecuted them was now preaching the faith he had once tried to destroy. And they praised God because of him. They praised God because of him, from the outside, without meeting him, because the transformation was so complete and so visible that even people who had only heard about it secondhand found it remarkable. He was not finished yet. The years of relative obscurity, of working and traveling and preaching in regions where his name did not carry the weight it would eventually carry, were still ahead of him. The great journeys had not yet begun. The letters had not yet been written. The confrontations that would define the shape of early Christianity had not yet happened. But the person who would do all of those things was now assembled. The wreckage of what he had been cleared away. Something new had been built in its place. Something that drew on everything he had been before Damascus, but organized it around a different center. He was ready. The world was not quite ready for him, but that had never stopped him before. Chapter 5. Antioch, where the future got its name. There is a city that most people skip over when they tell the story of early Christianity. They go from Jerusalem to Rome, from the Gospels to the letters, from the ministry of Jesus to the spread of the church across the empire. And in doing so, they miss the place where the actual transition happened. The place where a Jewish messianic movement began to become something that the Roman world could receive. The place where the questions that would define Christianity for the next 2,000 years were first asked out loud, in public, by people who were not sure of the answers. That city was Antioch. Antioch, in the middle of the 1st century, was the 3rd largest city in the Roman Empire. After Rome and Alexandria, it sat on the Orontes River in what is now southern Turkey, close to the Syrian border, at the junction of trade routes running east toward Mesopotamia and west toward the Mediterranean coast. It was a city of perhaps 500,000 people, which made it one of the great urban centers of the ancient world. A place where you could walk through the markets on a single afternoon and hear Greek and Aramaic and Latin and half a dozen other languages being spoken within a few hundred feet of each other. It was also a city with a significant Jewish population, a community that had been there for generations, that had built its synagogues and its networks and its ways of maintaining Jewish identity inside a thoroughly non-Jewish urban environment. And it was in Antioch, not in Jerusalem, that the Jesus movement first began to grapple seriously with what it meant to include people who were not Jewish at all. The community in Jerusalem had been overwhelmingly Jewish. The followers of Jesus there saw themselves as Jews who believed Jesus was the Messiah, and that identity shaped everything about how they organized their common life. They continued to attend the temple. They observed the Torah. The question of how non-Jews related to their movement had not yet become urgent, because in Jerusalem it was mostly a theoretical question. There were not that many non-Jews trying to join. In Antioch, it was not theoretical. It was happening in real time, in the streets and the homes and the gathering places of a cosmopolitan city where Jewish and Gentile populations lived in close proximity, where the boundary between communities was more porous than it was in Jerusalem, where a movement that was beginning to attract non-Jewish interest could not simply defer the question of what to do with that interest. Paul arrived in Antioch because Barnabas brought him there. Barnabas was one of the more important figures in the early church. a man with a gift for recognizing potential in people that others had written off. He had been the one who vouched for Paul in Jerusalem when everyone else was still afraid of him. Now, years later, he traveled to Tarsus to find Paul and bring him to Antioch, where the community was growing faster than its leadership could manage. They stayed together in Antioch for a full year. This is not a detail to rush past. A year is a long time. It is long enough to actually understand a community, to know its tensions and its strengths, and the specific ways that the vision it is trying to live out is being tested by the reality of the people trying to live it. Paul did not just pass through Antioch on his way somewhere else. He put down roots. He taught. He watched. He began to understand what a mixed community, Jewish and Gentile together, actually looked like in practice, and what it required of the people trying to hold it together. It was in Antioch that the followers of Jesus were first called Christians. The Greek word is Christianoi, meaning people of Christ, or Christ followers. Acts notes this almost in passing, as if it were a minor administrative detail, but it is anything but minor. The name was given by outsiders, by people in Antioch who were observing this community and needed something to call it. And the fact that they needed a new name at all tells you something important. This community had become distinct enough, visible enough, recognizable enough as its own thing, that the existing categories for Jewish groups and philosophical schools and religious associations did not quite fit it anymore. Something new was taking shape in Antioch, not fully formed yet, not with its questions answered or its boundaries defined, but new in a way that people outside the community could see before the people inside it had fully worked out what they were becoming. Then Peter came to visit. Peter's arrival in Antioch is one of the most important moments in the entire story of early Christianity, and it is recorded in only one place. A single passage in Paul's letter to the Galatians, written from Paul's perspective, years after the fact, in the heat of an argument about something related but not identical to what happened in Antioch, which means we have to read it knowing that Paul is not giving us a neutral historical account. He is making a point. He is using the story of what happened in Antioch as evidence in a theological argument he is currently having with the Galatian churches. With that caveat clearly on the table, here is what Paul says happened. Peter came to Antioch and ate with the Gentile members of the community. This was not a small thing. Eating together in the first century was not a casual social activity the way it is now. Sharing a meal meant sharing a table, and sharing a table was a statement about the relationship between the people at it. For a Jew to eat with Gentiles meant navigating questions about food laws and ritual purity that were not just personal preferences, but were bound up with the entire structure of how Jewish identity was maintained in a non-Jewish world. Peter ate with the Gentiles. He made a choice, in public, that said something about who he understood these people to be. Then people arrived from Jerusalem. Paul calls them people from James, meaning from James, the brother of Jesus, the leader of the Jerusalem community. And when they arrived, Peter withdrew. He stopped eating with the Gentiles. He separated himself, and other Jewish members of the community followed his lead, including, Paul says with obvious pain, even Barnabas. Paul confronted Peter to his face, in front of everyone. The words he uses in Galatians are not diplomatic. He says Peter stood condemned. He says his behavior was not in step with the truth of the gospel. He says to Peter directly, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? This confrontation is worth sitting inside for a moment, because it is easy to read it as Paul being right and Peter being wrong, the progressive hero challenging the traditionalist obstacle. But that reading flattens something that is actually quite complicated. Peter was not acting out of simple cowardice, though Paul implies something like cowardice was involved. He was caught between two communities he cared about, with two different sets of legitimate concerns. The Jerusalem community, James and the people around him, were not wrong to think carefully about the relationship between the Jesus movement and Jewish identity. They were Jews. They had inherited a covenant with specific requirements and specific markers. They were not being narrow-minded when they asked whether those markers still mattered. They were being faithful to a tradition that mattered to them, deeply and rightly. Paul was also not wrong. If the table could only be shared when the right people were not watching, if inclusion was conditional on who else was in the room, then the thing being proclaimed at that table was not actually what it claimed to be. The argument at Antioch was not between a progressive and a conservative. It was between two people who both loved the same tradition and disagreed, with genuine conviction, about what faithfulness to that tradition now required in light of what they both believed had happened with Jesus. That is a harder argument to resolve than a simple conflict between right and wrong. And it was not, in fact, fully resolved at Antioch. It would follow Paul for the rest of his ministry. What Antioch gave Paul was clarity about the stakes. The question was not just theological. It was practical and immediate and visible every time the community gathered to eat. Who gets to sit at the table? And who gets to decide? These were not questions that could be answered by a committee in Jerusalem issuing a ruling that everyone would accept. They had to be lived out, community by community, city by city, in the messy and often painful process of people from different backgrounds trying to figure out how to be one thing together. Paul left Antioch as a missionary, not just a teacher or a preacher or a member of a community, but someone with a specific calling, confirmed by the community itself, to carry this message into cities that had not yet heard it. He had spent years being formed in the desert, years learning what a mixed community actually looked like in a city like Antioch. He was as ready as he was going to get. The roads were waiting. The cities were waiting. And the questions that Antioch had raised but not answered were coming with him, packed into his bags along with everything else, ready to explode in new and unpredictable ways in every new place he arrived. Chapter 6. The Roads. Building churches in cities that didn't ask for them. Paul walked. That is the first thing to understand about the missionary journeys. The thing that gets lost when you look at them on a map with neat dotted lines running between labeled cities. The dotted lines make it look clean and purposeful, like a modern business trip with an itinerary and a hotel reservation. The reality was a man walking on Roman roads. Yes, the best road system the ancient world had ever built. But still roads that required putting one foot in front of the other for hours and days and weeks at a time, in heat and cold and rain, carrying whatever he needed on his back or in the hands of companions who shared the road with him. He also worked. This is another detail that tends to disappear in the telling. Paul was a tent maker by trade, a craftsman who worked with leather and canvas, and he continued this work throughout his missionary career. He was insistent about it. He did not want to be financially dependent on the communities he was building, did not want anyone to be able to say that he was in it for the money, did not want the message to be confused with the messenger's economic interests. So he worked with his hands in whatever city he was in, earning enough to eat and to sleep somewhere. And in the hours around the work he taught and argued and persuaded and built. He arrived in these cities with nothing that the Roman world recognized as status or authority. No official position, no institutional backing, no wealth, no army, no political connection that would have opened doors for him. He was a Jewish craftsman from the eastern provinces with an unusual message and an unusual intensity about delivering it. By every conventional measure of the first century, he was not someone who should have been able to build anything durable. And yet, the first journey took him and Barnabas west and north, through Cyprus and into the southern regions of what is now Turkey, through cities like Pisidian Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. The pattern repeated in each place. He would go first to the synagogue, where he could speak to Jews and God-fearers, Gentiles who were drawn to Jewish monotheism and Jewish ethics, but had not formally converted. He would present his argument about Jesus as the fulfillment of Israel's story. Some people responded. Others were hostile. Eventually, the hostility would become dangerous, and he would move on, leaving behind a small group of people who had believed and who now had to figure out how to sustain themselves as a community without the person who had introduced them to the idea. In Lystra, he was stoned, left for dead outside the city. He got up and walked back into the city, and then the next day continued to the next town. This is not the behavior of a man who is doing something because it is convenient or comfortable or because it comes naturally to him. This is the behavior of a man who has decided that he has no other option, who is driven by something he cannot turn off, who has looked at the alternative, which is to stop, to go somewhere safe and quiet and stay there, and has found that alternative genuinely impossible to choose. The second journey was longer and went further west. This is the journey that took Paul into Europe for the first time, across the Aegean into Macedonia and Greece, into cities that had no existing Jewish community to serve as a starting point, where the cultural distance between Paul's message and his audience was even greater than it had been in the East. Philippi was a Roman colony, a city of retired soldiers and their families, a place where Roman identity and Roman values were worn with particular pride. Status mattered enormously in Philippi. Honor and shame, the social currencies of the Roman world, organized everything. Paul arrived and found his first convert in a woman named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth, a businesswoman with enough resources to host the small community in her home. The community in Philippi would become one of the closest to Paul's heart. The letter he wrote to them later, from prison, is the warmest thing he ever put on paper. He was also beaten and imprisoned in Philippi. He and Silas were stripped and flogged and thrown into the inner cell of the prison with their feet fastened in stocks. Acts describes them praying and singing hymns at midnight, which is either one of the most remarkable images in the whole story or one of the most human, depending on how you read it. A midnight earthquake shook the prison. The doors opened. The jailer, assuming his prisoners had escaped and knowing what Rome did to jailers who lost their prisoners, was about to kill himself. Paul stopped him. The jailer was baptized before dawn. The next morning, the city magistrates sent word to release them. Paul refused to leave quietly. He was a Roman citizen, he pointed out, and they had beaten him publicly without a trial, which was illegal. He was not going to slip out of town in the dark and let them pretend nothing had happened. They came in person to apologize and escort him out. This is Paul using his Roman citizenship not to escape but to make a point, to ensure that the community he was leaving behind in Philippi would not be seen as criminals, but as people whose leader had been wrongly treated by the city's own officials. Thessalonica was a major port city, politically significant, and Paul's stay there was cut short by opposition from the local Jewish community, who brought accusations against his hosts before the city authorities. He had to leave suddenly. In the middle of the night, he would write to the Thessalonian community not long afterward. The letter that most scholars believe is the earliest surviving piece of Christian writing, earlier than any of the Gospels, earlier than anything else in the New Testament. The Thessalonians had a specific and urgent question. People in their community had died since Paul left. What happened to them? If Jesus was returning soon, if the great day was coming, had those who died before it arrived missed it? Were they lost? Paul's answer to this question in 1 Thessalonians is the first extended piece of Christian theology about death and resurrection that we have. It was not written in a quiet study by a theologian with time to think. It was written by a man who had left a community before he was ready to leave, who was worried about them, who received word that they were struggling with something he had not fully prepared them for, and who sat down and tried to help. This is what the letters are. Not systematic theology delivered from a position of calm authority, crisis management delivered from a distance, by someone who cared about the people on the other end of the letter and was doing his best to help them with what he had. Athens was different from anything else on the journey. Paul arrived there alone, waiting for Silas and Timothy to catch up. And while he waited, he walked through the city and looked at it. Acts says his spirit was provoked within him as he saw the city full of idols. But what followed was not a denunciation. He went to the Areopagus, the place where Athenian intellectuals gathered to discuss ideas, and he gave a speech that is unlike anything else he ever said. He did not begin with the Hebrew Scriptures. He began with a monument he had seen in the city, an altar with the inscription, "To an unknown God." He told the Athenians that he was there to tell them about this unknown God. He quoted their own poets. He argued in the philosophical language that Athens understood. He was doing what he had always done, reading the room he was in, finding the door that was already there, and walking through it. The response in Athens was mixed. Some people sneered when he mentioned resurrection. Some said they wanted to hear more. A few believed. Paul moved on to Corinth, and Corinth was where he stayed. 18 months. That is how long Paul remained in Corinth on his second journey. Longer than anywhere else on the journey. Long enough to sink real roots, to build something substantial, to know the community and its people in a way that a brief visit could never allow. He worked with Priscilla and Aquila, a Jewish couple who were also tent makers, who had recently arrived from Rome after the Emperor Claudius had expelled Jews from the city. He taught every Sabbath in the synagogue. When opposition grew too strong there, he moved his base to the house next door and continued. Corinth was one of the great commercial cities of the ancient world, a place where merchants from across the Mediterranean came together, where social classes mixed in ways they did not in more traditional cities, where wealth and poverty existed in extremely close proximity, and where the question of status, of who was important and who was not, was constantly being renegotiated. It was not a peaceful city or a simple one. It was exactly the kind of city where a message about a community that crossed every social boundary would find both its greatest reception and its greatest complications. The complications would come later. They would come in the form of letters from Corinth, reporting problems that Paul had not anticipated and could not fix in person. They would come in the form of long, painful, urgent responses from Paul, trying to hold together a community that was pulling itself apart. But in those 18 months, something was built, something that outlasted the building of it, something that Paul would love and fight for and grieve over for the rest of his life. He left Corinth and headed back to Antioch. The second journey was over. The third was already forming in his mind before the second was fully finished. There were cities he had not yet reached. There were communities he had built that needed more than the occasional letter. There was Ephesus, the great city of Western Asia, where he had stopped briefly on his way home and promised to return. He always returned. That was the thing about Paul. He always went back. Until, eventually, he could not. Chapter 7. Who gets to belong? The fight that defined everything. There is a question underneath all of Paul's letters, underneath all of his journeys, underneath every argument he ever had and every community he ever built. It is not a complicated question to state. It is one of the most complicated questions in the history of religion to answer. Who gets to belong? Not in the abstract sense of who is welcome to attend a gathering or who is permitted to express interest. In the deepest sense, who is inside the covenant? Who is part of the people of God? And on whose terms? These questions had always been present in the Jesus movement, but in the early years they were manageable, because the movement was largely Jewish, and the people asking the questions were all working within the same basic framework. But as the movement spread into cities like Antioch and Philippi and Corinth, as more and more non-Jewish people began to believe that Jesus was the Messiah and that his resurrection had changed everything, the questions became impossible to avoid, and the answer was not obvious. On one side of the argument were people who said that the covenant God had made with Israel was the covenant God had made with Israel. It had specific markers. Circumcision was not just a cultural practice. It was the sign of the covenant, the physical mark that distinguished the people of God from the nations. Going all the way back to Abraham, if a Gentile wanted to belong to the people of God, there was a path. There had always been a path. You converted. You accepted the Torah. You were circumcised. If you were male, you became Jewish, and then you belonged. This was not a cruel or narrow position. It was a coherent and serious theological argument rooted in Scripture. The people making it were not trying to exclude Gentiles. They were trying to ensure that inclusion meant something. That belonging to the people of God was not something you could claim while bypassing the covenant that defined what the people of God actually were. On the other side was Paul. Paul's argument was that something new had happened in Jesus. Something that did not simply continue the old arrangement, but fulfilled and transformed it in ways that changed who could belong and how. The blessing promised to Abraham, Paul argued from Genesis, had always been intended for all nations, not just for Israel. The law, the Torah, had been added later, as a temporary guardian, serving a specific purpose in a specific period of the story. But with the coming of the Messiah, with the resurrection of Jesus, a new age had begun. The promise to Abraham was now available to everyone, Jew and Gentile alike, through faith, not through the ethnic and ritual markers of the Mosaic covenant. This was not a rejection of Israel's story. Paul never saw it that way. He spent enormous energy arguing that the Gentile inclusion was the fulfillment of Israel's story, not its replacement. But it was a radical reimagining of what the story meant and where it had always been going. And it had practical implications that were impossible to contain. If Gentiles were full members of the people of God through faith in Jesus, without needing to be circumcised, then what happened at the dinner table? Could Jewish believers eat with Gentile believers without violating the food laws that were part of the Torah? If the answer was yes, then the Torah's role in defining community boundaries had fundamentally changed. If the answer was no, then the unity of the community was compromised every time people tried to share a meal. This was not a theoretical problem. It happened every time the community gathered. The Jerusalem Council, which took place around 49 AD, was the attempt to resolve this at the level of the whole movement. Paul and Barnabas traveled to Jerusalem from Antioch, bringing the question directly to the leadership. Peter was there. James was there. It was, by any measure, one of the most consequential meetings in the history of religion. Acts gives us one account of what happened. Paul gives us another. In Galatians, with different emphases and a somewhat different sequence. The two accounts are not entirely contradictory, but they are not identical either, and the differences are illuminating. Acts presents a relatively smooth process, with Peter speaking in favor of Gentile inclusion, James offering a compromise, and the council issuing a letter to the Gentile churches asking them to abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality, but not requiring circumcision. Paul's account in Galatians is less smooth. He presents the Jerusalem meeting as a private consultation with the pillars, his word, of the Jerusalem community, in which they added nothing to his gospel. He is insistent that his agreement with the Jerusalem leaders was not them approving his message, but them recognizing that he had been entrusted with a distinct mission to the Gentiles, just as Peter had been entrusted with a mission to the Jews. What both accounts agree on is that the Jerusalem Council did not require Gentile believers to be circumcised. That much was settled, or seemed to be, because then came Antioch, the confrontation between Paul and Peter that we visited in the last chapter, which happened after the Jerusalem Council, not before it, shows that the settlement was not as settled as it appeared. Peter's withdrawal from the Gentile table was not a simple lapse of personal courage. It was a symptom of the fact that the question had not actually been answered at its deepest level. The Jerusalem Council had made a practical decision. It had not resolved the theological question that the practical decision depended on. Paul resolved it. In Galatians. Galatians is the most urgent letter Paul ever wrote. There is no greeting, no thanksgiving, nothing that cushions the opening. He goes straight to the point. He has heard that the Galatian churches, communities he had built on his first journey, are turning to a different gospel. Teachers have come in after him and are telling the Galatian believers that they need to be circumcised, that they need to take on the full requirements of the Torah, that what Paul told them was incomplete. Paul's response is one of the most sustained theological arguments in the ancient world, and it is also one of the most personal. He is not writing a calm academic treatise. He is writing like a man whose children are being told by someone else that their father's parenting was inadequate, and here is what you were actually supposed to learn. The anger is real. The hurt is real. At one point he says he wishes the people who are insisting on circumcision would go the whole way and castrate themselves. That is not the language of a man who is comfortable with the tone of the debate. The center of his argument is a single claim about Abraham. Before circumcision, before the Mosaic covenant, before the law, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Abraham was justified by faith, not by the works of the law, because the law had not yet been given when Abraham was declared righteous. The promise to Abraham that all nations would be blessed through him was always a promise about faith, not about ethnic or ritual markers. Circumcision came later, as a sign, but the reality it pointed to was already there, in Abraham's faith. Therefore, Paul argues, those who are of faith are the children of Abraham, all of them, Jew and Gentile, because Abraham was not yet Jewish, in the ethnic and covenant sense. When God called him righteous, he was a human being who believed, and that was enough. From that argument flows one of the most radical sentences in the ancient world. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. This sentence has been debated and interpreted and applied and misapplied for 2,000 years. People have used it to argue for abolition and for women's equality and for the breaking down of every social barrier that human beings have ever erected. People have also pointed out that Paul did not immediately draw all of those implications himself, that his letters contain other passages that seem to limit women in ways that this verse does not, that he did not lead a campaign to abolish slavery as an institution. Both things are true. The vision in Galatians 3:28 is larger than Paul fully implemented. Most visions are. The people who articulate a principle do not always live out all of its implications, because living out all of the implications of a genuinely radical idea requires more than one lifetime, more than one generation, more than one community working through the consequences in real time. What Paul did was put the principle into words. He said it clearly, in a letter that was copied and shared and read aloud in communities across the Mediterranean world. He named something that the Jesus movement had been groping toward and had not yet fully articulated. Something about the nature of belonging and the nature of the people of God that, once said, could not be unsaid. The fight was not over. It would continue in various forms throughout Paul's ministry and long after his death. Communities would continue to wrestle with the practical implications of the principle he had articulated. The relationship between Jewish and Gentile followers of Jesus would remain complicated and often painful. The question of who gets to define belonging would resurface in every new context the movement entered. But the argument had been made. The most important theological argument of the first century had been put on paper, in clear and passionate and sometimes furious prose, by a man sitting somewhere, probably in Macedonia or Corinth, with news from Galatia that had made him angry enough to write without the usual diplomatic warm-up. He was angry because he cared. He cared because these were his people. He had built these communities. He had walked into these cities with nothing and had built something. And now someone was telling those communities that what Paul had built was not enough. That there was a second step, a higher requirement, a threshold they had not yet crossed. He disagreed. And when Paul disagreed, he wrote. And when Paul wrote, the world eventually had to reckon with what he said. That is the thing about the letters. They were written in urgency, in conflict, in the heat of arguments that felt immediate and local and particular, but they survived the urgency. They outlasted the specific conflict. They carried the argument into every new context the movement entered, and then into contexts Paul could not have imagined, and then into the world we live in now, still asking, in different languages and different institutions and different communities, the same question that Paul was answering when he wrote to the Galatians: who gets to belong, and who gets to decide? Chapter 8, Corinth, the community that almost broke him. If you want to understand what Paul was actually like as a person, not as a theological system or a historical figure or a name in a stained glass window, read the Corinthian letters. Not Romans, with its careful architecture and its systematic movement from problem to argument to conclusion. Not Galatians, with its surgical anger and its tightly controlled polemic. Read 1st and 2nd Corinthians, especially 2nd Corinthians, and you will find something that the other letters only show you in glimpses. You will find a man who is tired, a man who is defending himself and knows that the act of defending himself makes him look weak and is doing it anyway because he has no other option. A man who loves a community that has hurt him and is trying to figure out how to hold on to both things at once. The love and the hurt, without letting either one destroy what he is trying to do. Corinth was Paul's most complicated relationship. It was also, in many ways, his most important one. The city itself was unlike anywhere else in the Roman world. Corinth sat on the narrow strip of land connecting mainland Greece to the Peloponnese, which meant that ships traveling between the eastern and western Mediterranean had two choices. They could sail around the entire southern tip of Greece, a dangerous and time-consuming route, or they could dock at one of Corinth's two ports, have their cargo hauled overland across the isthmus, and reload onto another ship on the other side. Corinth collected fees on everything that passed through. It was one of the wealthiest cities in the Roman Empire as a result. A place where enormous fortunes were made and spent, where social mobility was real in ways it was not in more traditional cities, where the question of status and who had it and how you got it and how you displayed it was constantly in play. The community Paul built there during his 18 months on the second journey reflected the city it was in. It was diverse in ways that few first-century communities were. Wealthy patrons and their households, artisans and tradespeople, slaves, freedmen, Jewish members and Gentile members, people from across the social spectrum sitting together, eating together, trying to figure out what it meant to be one community across all of those differences. It was also, apparently, exhausting. Paul left Corinth at the end of his second journey and stayed in contact through messengers and letters. What came back to him from Corinth was a steady stream of reports about problems that seemed almost designed to test every principle he had ever tried to teach. The community had divided into factions. Some people said they followed Paul. Others said they followed Apollos, a gifted teacher who had come to Corinth after Paul left. Others claimed Peter. Others said they followed Christ alone, which sounds most spiritual but was probably the most sectarian of all. The faction of people too sophisticated to admit they were a faction. They were competing over whose leader was most impressive, most eloquent, most spiritually powerful, turning the community into a contest about human status at the exact moment when Paul had been trying to build something that transcended human status. There was a man in the community sleeping with his father's wife, a relationship that even Gentile moral standards found shocking. And the community, rather than addressing it, was proud. Paul does not speculate much about why they were proud, but the pride suggests that some members of the community had developed a theology of spiritual freedom that led them to believe that what the body did no longer mattered, that spiritual people were above ordinary moral categories. This was not what Paul had taught. It was a distortion of something he had taught, stretched in a direction that produced conclusions he found horrifying. People were taking each other to court before Roman judges rather than resolving disputes within the community. The wealthy members were arriving early to the communal meal, eating the good food and drinking the wine, and leaving the poorer members who came later after their work was finished to find whatever was left. The meal that was supposed to be a declaration of unity had become a demonstration of exactly the social divisions it was supposed to overcome. There were arguments about whether it was acceptable to eat meat that had been sacrificed to idols, which was most of the meat available in a city like Corinth. Since most butchering happened in the context of temple worship, there were arguments about spiritual gifts, about who had the more impressive gifts, about whether speaking in tongues was a sign of superior spirituality. There were questions about marriage and celibacy and resurrection, and whether the dead would literally rise or whether resurrection was purely spiritual. Paul responded to all of it. 1 Corinthians is his attempt to address the entire catalog of problems in a single letter, moving from issue to issue with varying degrees of patience, sometimes reasoning carefully, sometimes commanding directly, sometimes expressing a frustration that he barely keeps below the surface. But it is in the middle of 1 Corinthians, in a passage that begins as an argument about spiritual gifts and their proper use in the community, that Paul writes the thing that has outlasted every specific controversy he was addressing. He tells the Corinthians that he will show them a more excellent way. And then he writes the 13th chapter, "If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith, so as to remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing." This is not a poem about romantic love. Paul is not writing a wedding reading. He is writing to a community that is tearing itself apart over spiritual status, over who has the more impressive gifts, over who is more important and whose leader is better, and whose position in the community is more deserving of respect. And into the middle of all of that, he writes this, that none of it matters, that all of the things they are competing over, the tongues, the prophecy, the knowledge, the faith, are nothing without love, that the community they are supposed to be is not a competition, it is a practice. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. 2,000 years later, people read these words at weddings, which Paul would probably find both flattering and slightly beside the point. He wrote them for a community that was failing to love each other in the most ordinary and practical ways, for people who were eating all the food before the poor members arrived, for people who were dragging each other into Roman courts, for factions that were competing over whose apostle was more impressive. He wrote them as a corrective, not as a celebration, but the corrective became the thing itself. The words he wrote to address a specific crisis in a specific community, in a specific city, became something that people have been reaching for ever since when they try to say what love is supposed to look like. After 1 Corinthians, the situation in Corinth got worse, not better. Paul made what he calls a painful visit, a trip to Corinth that went badly enough that he left without resolving what he had come to resolve, and then wrote a severe letter. a letter that he describes in 2 Corinthians as one he wrote out of much affliction and anguish of heart and with many tears. That letter does not survive. We do not know exactly what it said, but Paul's description of writing it tells you something about the cost of what he was doing. He was not issuing commands from a safe distance. He was writing with tears, which means he was writing from a place of real pain, about people he loved, about a community that he had given 2 years of his life to build, and that was in the process of rejecting him. 2 Corinthians, which came after the painful visit and the severe letter, is the most personally revealing thing Paul ever wrote. His opponents in Corinth, people he calls sarcastically the super-apostles, had been attacking him in his absence. They said he was bold in his letters but weak in person. They said his physical presence was unimpressive and his speaking was of no account. They questioned his credentials as an apostle. They implied that he was inferior to the Jerusalem leadership. They had apparently been winning some of this argument, because the community that had once been Paul's was now at least partially persuaded that Paul was not what he had claimed to be. This is his resume, not the victories, the wounds. He is making an argument that his opponents cannot make, because his opponents have not paid what he has paid, and he is making it in the language of weakness, not strength, which was the exact reversal of what his culture expected. In the Roman world, a great man demonstrated his greatness through power and dominance and the ability to compel others. Paul is arguing that his authority comes from exactly the opposite, from his willingness to suffer, from the fact that he has kept going through things that would have stopped most people, from the endurance that he presents, not as his own achievement, but as the power of the one he serves, working through his weakness. There is something almost unbearable about 2 Corinthians if you read it slowly. It is the letter of a man who has given everything to a community and is now being told by that community that he is not enough, and he cannot simply let it go. Not because of his ego, though there is certainly something of his ego in the letter, but because he believes that what they are about to lose if they turn away from his gospel is not just their connection to him, it is something much larger. The Corinthian situation eventually improved. At least partially. The community came back to Paul, or enough of them did. He visited again, a third visit, and stayed for 3 months. During those 3 months in Corinth, he wrote Romans, the most comprehensive and carefully argued letter of his entire career. A letter he was sending ahead to a community he had never visited, making his case as fully and as systematically as he knew how. He was preparing to go to Jerusalem. He knew it was risky. He knew that Jerusalem was not the safe harbor it might have been for someone with a simpler story. He was taking the collection from the Gentile churches as an offering, a concrete symbol of the unity he had been arguing for in theological terms. He was not finished with Corinth. He never would be. Some relationships are like that. They do not reach a clean resolution. They stay open, complicated, tended from a distance, held together by something stronger than any single conflict and more durable than any single failure. He loved Corinth the way you love the things that have cost you the most. He left Corinth for the last time and headed toward Jerusalem. He did not know it was the last time. Chapter 9. The Man Behind the Theology. There is a line in 2 Corinthians that stops most readers cold the first time they notice it. Paul is in the middle of defending his apostleship, listing everything he has endured, making the argument that his suffering is his credential. And then, almost in passing, he mentions something that he has mentioned once before, in Galatians, that he calls a thorn in his flesh. He says he pleaded with God 3 times to remove it, and God did not remove it. The answer he received was not the removal of the thorn, but a statement, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Scholars have been debating for centuries what the thorn was. A physical illness, chronic pain, a speech impediment, a specific opponent who caused him grief wherever he went. The text does not tell us. Paul chose not to say. And his choice not to say is itself a kind of communication. This was something he carried privately, something he had prayed about and not received the answer he wanted, something that remained with him as a limitation he could not overcome. That image of Paul praying 3 times for something to be removed and being told no is not the image of a marble saint. It is the image of a human being. And that is the point of this chapter. Not Paul's theology, not his journeys, not his arguments. The man who did all of those things, what he was actually like, what he carried, how he moved through the world in a body that took punishment and kept going, dependent on people he loved and sometimes hurt, brilliant and difficult and vulnerable and funny and stubborn and not always right. He worked with his hands. This is easy to forget when you are reading letters of such intellectual sophistication that scholars have spent entire careers trying to understand them. Paul was a craftsman. He made tents, or possibly worked with leather more broadly. And he did this work throughout his ministry. In Corinth, he worked alongside Priscilla and Aquila, 2 people who became among his closest collaborators. He was not embarrassed by the work. He was proud of it. He references it repeatedly as evidence that he has not burdened the communities he built, that he has earned his own way, that the message he carries is not something he is doing for profit. There is something grounding about that detail. The man who wrote about the mystery of the gospel and the wisdom of God hidden since before the ages spent his days cutting and stitching leather with his hands. He was not above the physical world. He was in it, sweating and calloused and tired at the end of the day like anyone else who works with their body. He was also, by any honest reading of his letters, not an easy person to be around. He could be harsh when he is angry, which is often. The anger comes through the page with a directness that leaves no room for softening. He tells the Galatians he is astonished at how quickly they have turned away. And the astonishment sounds more like accusation than surprise. He calls the super-apostles in Corinth fools and says he is speaking like a madman when he boasts. He says he wishes the circumcision party would go the whole way and mutilate themselves. He is not a man who softens his language when he thinks something is wrong. He could also be tender in ways that the sharpness makes more striking by contrast. The letter to the Philippians, written from prison, is full of warmth. He calls the Philippians his joy and his crown. He says he holds them in his heart. In the letter to Philemon, a short personal note about a runaway slave named Onesimus, he writes with a gentleness and a careful attention to relationship that shows someone who understood the difference between winning an argument and actually persuading someone you love. Philemon is one of the most interesting things Paul ever wrote, precisely because it is the smallest and the most human. Onesimus was a slave who had apparently run away from his owner Philemon, a member of one of Paul's communities. Somehow Onesimus had ended up in Paul's company while Paul was in prison. Paul had come to regard him with genuine affection. He calls him his child. He says that in sending Onesimus back, he is sending his own heart. He asks Philemon to receive Onesimus back, not as a slave, but as a dear brother. He says that if Onesimus has wronged Philemon or owes him anything, charge it to Paul's account. He says he could command Philemon to do what he is asking, but prefers to appeal to him on the basis of love. Paul does not tell Philemon to free Onesimus. He does not say slavery is wrong. He works within the institution rather than against it, which is one of the places where Paul's readers across the centuries have struggled most with his legacy. But he does something that is, in its own way, deeply subversive. He insists that within the community of Jesus' followers, the category of slave and the category of master cannot remain what they were. Onesimus is now a dear brother. Philemon is being asked to receive him accordingly. What that means for the practical arrangement of their relationship, Paul leaves to Philemon to work out. It is both a profound statement and an insufficient one. And the tension between those two things is real and should not be dissolved in either direction. Paul was not blind to the humanity of enslaved people. He was also not willing or able to confront the institution of slavery as a system. Both things are true about him, and both things matter. He was deeply dependent on the people around him, which is another thing that tends to get lost in the image of Paul as a lone hero striding across the Roman world. His letters are full of names: Priscilla and Aquila, who risked their lives for him. He says, Timothy, his genuine child in the faith, whom he sent ahead to communities when he could not go himself, whom he describes with genuine affection as someone who has proven himself. Titus, another trusted representative. Silas, Luke, Epaphroditus, who nearly died in service to the community in Philippi. And women. The number of women in Paul's network is striking, especially given how his words about women in certain letters have been used for centuries to exclude women from leadership. Phoebe is described as a deacon of the church at Cenchrea and as a benefactor of many, including Paul himself. She is the one who carried the letter to the Romans to Rome, which means she was trusted with the most important piece of theological writing Paul ever produced. Junia, mentioned in Romans 16, is described as outstanding among the apostles, which in Paul's usage means she is recognized as an apostle herself. Priscilla is consistently named before her husband Aquila, an unusual ordering in the first century that most scholars read as indicating her greater prominence in the community. This Paul, the Paul who relied on Phoebe to deliver Romans and called Junia outstanding among the apostles, is not easily reconciled with the Paul who wrote that women should be silent in the churches, or that he does not permit a woman to teach. Scholars have spent decades on this reconciliation, arguing about which letters are authentically Paul's and which were written by later authors in his name, arguing about what specific local situations the instructions were addressing, arguing about how to read individual passages in their ancient context. The honest thing to say is that the tension is real and has not been resolved to everyone's satisfaction, and probably will not be. Paul's relationship to women in his communities was more complex than either those who use him to restrict women or those who use him to advocate for full equality tend to acknowledge. He worked with women as partners and leaders. He also wrote things that have been used to limit women's roles for 2,000 years. Both of those things are part of who he was. He was also, if the evidence of his letters is read carefully, a man who lived with a significant level of anxiety about the communities he had built. Not the confident apostle striding from city to city without a backward glance. A man who sent Timothy to check on the Thessalonians because he could not stand not knowing how they were doing and was afraid that the tempter had somehow gotten to them. A man who wrote to the Galatians that he was in the anguish of childbirth over them again, afraid that his work among them had been for nothing. A man who told the Corinthians that in addition to everything else, he faced daily the pressure of his anxiety for all the churches. Daily, the pressure of his anxiety for all the churches. This is not the language of someone who has achieved a state of serene spiritual detachment from the outcomes of his efforts. This is the language of someone who built things he could not fully control, who loved people he could not fully reach, who sent letters into the void and then waited, with whatever patience he could manage, to find out whether they had arrived in time and whether they had done what he hoped. There is a moment in Philippians, written from prison, where Paul says he has learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. He has learned it. It did not come naturally. It was something he had to acquire, through the specific education of a life that had given him both plenty and want in sufficient measure that he had eventually stopped being surprised by either. He was in his 50s by the time he was writing from Rome, which was old for the first century. Old for a man who had been beaten and stoned and shipwrecked and hungry and imprisoned. His body had been through things that would have killed other people, and some of those things had left marks. He had a body that bore the history of what he had done with it, and he was still going. Not because he did not feel the cost. Clearly he did. The letters make that plain. But because the cost had never been the deciding factor. The deciding factor was something else. Something he had encountered on a road in Syria and had been trying to explain ever since. Something that he had decided, somewhere in those 3 days of darkness in Damascus, was worth everything he had and more. He was not finished yet. But Jerusalem was waiting. And Jerusalem had its own ideas about Paul. Chapter 10. Jerusalem, Rome, and the price of going back. Paul knew what he was walking into. This is not a detail added later by people trying to make the story more dramatic. It is there in the sources, in Paul's own words, in the accounts of people who traveled with him. Before he left for Jerusalem, he wrote to the Roman community, asking them to pray that he would be rescued from the unbelievers in Judea, and that his service to Jerusalem might be acceptable to the saints. That is not the language of a man who expects a warm welcome. It is the language of a man who has done the calculation and is going anyway. He was bringing the collection. For several years, across the communities he had built in Macedonia and Greece and Asia Minor, Paul had been gathering money. He mentions it in his letters, instructs the Corinthians about setting aside a portion each week, thanks the Philippians for their partnership in the gospel, describes the generosity of the Macedonian churches as extraordinary given the poverty they were themselves experiencing. This was not fundraising in the ordinary sense. It was a theological act, a statement in concrete material form about something Paul had been arguing in theological terms for years. The Gentile churches were not separate from the Jerusalem community. They were part of the same body. They owed something to the people from whom they had received the message. And so the churches that Paul had built across the Roman world were going to send their money, gathered coin by coin in the homes and meeting places of people in Corinth and Philippi and Ephesus and Galatia, back to Jerusalem. Gentile believers supporting Jewish believers. The edges of the movement honoring its center. If Jerusalem received it, that reception was itself a statement, an acknowledgement that what Paul had built out there in the cities of the Roman world was real, was connected, was part of the same story. If Jerusalem refused it, or received it with reluctance, or attached conditions that undermined the terms on which it was offered, then the fracture that had been running through the movement since Antioch was deeper than anyone had wanted to admit. Paul knew the reception was not guaranteed. He asked for prayer that it would be acceptable. That word, acceptable, carries weight. It suggests doubt. It suggests that the outcome was not certain and that the uncertainty was one of the things he was carrying as he headed toward the city. He traveled in a group, representatives from the various communities contributing to the collection, which was itself a statement. These were Gentile men accompanying Paul to Jerusalem with the money of their communities in their hands. A delegation of the new thing, walking into the heart of the old thing with an offering and a hope. Luke, or whoever wrote Acts, describes the journey with a detail that is easy to miss. At several points along the way, people with prophetic gifts told Paul what was waiting for him in Jerusalem. In Tyre, disciples told him through the Spirit not to go to Jerusalem. In Caesarea, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea, took Paul's belt, tied his own hands and feet with it, and said that this was what the Jews in Jerusalem would do to the man who owned this belt. They would bind him and hand him over to the Gentiles. Paul's companions wept. They begged him not to go. He said, "What are you doing? Weeping and breaking my heart. I am ready not only to be imprisoned, but even to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." He went. Jerusalem received him. James and all the elders were there for the meeting. Paul reported what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. They glorified God when they heard it. And then they told him about a problem. There were many thousands of Jewish believers in Jerusalem, and all of them were zealous for the law, and they had heard rumors about Paul. that he was teaching all the Jews who lived among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to the Jewish customs. Whether this was an accurate characterization of what Paul taught is debatable. Paul himself, in his letters, is careful to say that circumcision is not required for Gentiles, but never explicitly tells Jewish believers to abandon their practices. But the rumors were circulating, and they were creating a problem for the Jerusalem community. The elders proposed a solution. There were 4 men in the community who had taken a vow. Paul should join them in the purification rites associated with completing the vow, pay for the costs of the ceremony, and in this way demonstrate publicly that he himself lived in observance of the law. Then everyone would know that the rumors were false. Paul agreed. This detail has puzzled people ever since. The man who wrote that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek. The man who confronted Peter to his face for separating himself from Gentile table fellowship. The man whose entire theological project was organized around the argument that the Torah had been fulfilled and transformed in Jesus, was willing to go into the temple and perform a purification ritual to demonstrate his observance of the law. Was this hypocrisy, pragmatism, a genuine expression of Paul's own Jewish identity that his letters sometimes obscure because he is usually arguing with Gentile audiences about different questions? Perhaps all 3. Perhaps none of them exactly. Paul was a man who said he had become all things to all people, that with those under the law he lived as one under the law. He may have seen this ritual not as a contradiction of his theology, but as an expression of his flexibility, his willingness to meet people where they were, rather than insisting they come to where he was. He went to the temple, near the end of the 7 days required for the purification rites. Jews from the province of Asia saw him in the temple. They recognized him. They had encountered him in the eastern cities, had heard him preach, had opposed him. And now here he was in Jerusalem, in the temple, and with him was a Gentile man named Trophimus, whom they had seen with him in the city. They made an accusation. Paul had brought a Gentile into the temple, they said, violating the sanctity of the inner courts where non-Jews were forbidden to enter. This was not true. Paul had not brought Trophimus into the temple, but the accusation did not need to be true to be effective. The crowd that gathered was a crowd that had already been primed by months of rumors about Paul. The accusation landed in a space that was ready to receive it. They seized Paul. They dragged him out of the temple. They were beating him. The Roman tribune, whose troops were stationed in the fortress overlooking the temple complex, saw the riot and came down with soldiers. The beating stopped because the soldiers arrived, not because the crowd was finished. The tribune had Paul bound with chains and began trying to find out what had happened, which was not easy because the crowd was shouting different things simultaneously. He could not determine the facts in the chaos. So he ordered Paul brought into the barracks. On the steps of the barracks, Paul asked the tribune for permission to speak to the people. The tribune, perhaps surprised that this bloodied man was speaking to him in Greek, granted it. Paul addressed the crowd in Hebrew, or Aramaic, the language of the people. He told his story, his background, Damascus, the years that followed, the mission to the Gentiles. The crowd listened until he said the word Gentiles. Then they erupted again. The tribune brought Paul inside and ordered him flogged in order to find out why the crowd was reacting this way. And here Paul used the weapon he had been carrying his entire life without ever fully showing it. He asked the centurion standing nearby if it was legal to flog a Roman citizen who had not been condemned. The centurion went to the tribune. The tribune came to Paul and confirmed the question. Paul said yes. He was a Roman citizen. The men who had been about to flog him withdrew immediately. The next day the tribune brought Paul before the Jewish council to try to understand the charges. The hearing became a chaos of its own when Paul set the Pharisees and Sadducees against each other by declaring himself a Pharisee and saying the charge against him was about the resurrection of the dead, which was a point of deep disagreement between the two groups. The council dissolved in argument. The tribune had Paul taken back to the barracks. That night, Acts says, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." Rome, it was where this had always been going. In some sense, the center of the world, the city whose roads Paul had been traveling on for years, whose law had protected him and also imprisoned him, whose reach extended to every city where he had built a community. He had written to Rome already. He had wanted to go there, to preach there, to see the community that had gathered in that city without his involvement. He had said in his letter that he was planning to visit on his way to Spain. He was going to get there, but not the way he had planned. A plot formed among a group of Jews to kill Paul before he could be transferred to the Roman governor. Paul's nephew heard about it and reported it to the tribune. The tribune arranged a military escort of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to take Paul to Caesarea at night, out of reach of the plot. 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen. For one man, the Roman Empire mobilized nearly 500 soldiers to move a single prisoner from Jerusalem to Caesarea. A tent-making former Pharisee who had been traveling with nothing but his letters and his convictions for 30 years. The machinery of the greatest empire in the world was now responsible for getting Paul where he was going. He appeared before the governor Felix in Caesarea. Felix listened and then deferred the case, saying he would decide when the tribune came down. He kept Paul in custody but gave him some liberty and allowed his friends to take care of him. Felix talked with Paul regularly, we are told, hoping that Paul would offer him money. Paul did not offer money. 2 years passed. Felix was succeeded by Festus. The new governor wanted to do the Jewish leadership a favor and asked Paul if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem for trial. Paul refused. He appealed to Caesar. As a Roman citizen, he had that right. Once invoked, the appeal could not be easily set aside. Festus consulted with his advisors and then said the words that would determine the last years of Paul's life. "You have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you will go." Paul had used the empire's own system to get himself to the empire's capital. He had not set out to do this. He had set out to go to Jerusalem with an offering and a hope. What he had gotten instead was a chain of events that was now depositing him, 2 years after his arrest, onto a ship bound for Rome. The sea voyage was not peaceful. Acts describes a long and difficult journey. Contrary winds. A stop in Crete where Paul warned against continuing and was overruled. A storm that lasted 2 weeks and drove the ship across the Adriatic. A shipwreck on the island of Malta. 3 months in Malta while they waited for another ship. Then onward. Paul arrived in Rome in the early 60s AD. Members of the Roman community came out to meet him on the road. And when Paul saw them, Acts says, he thanked God and took courage. He was a prisoner. He was under guard. His case had not been decided. He did not know how long he would be waiting or what the outcome would be. But he was in Rome. He immediately called together the local Jewish leaders, explained his situation, told them he had not done anything against the people or the customs of the ancestors, and asked to speak with them about the hope of Israel. They said they wanted to hear what he thought. They arranged a day for a larger meeting. Paul argued with them all day about Jesus from the Scriptures. Some were persuaded. Others were not. He stayed in Rome for 2 years in his own rented quarters, with a soldier guarding him, welcoming everyone who came to see him, proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with all boldness and without hindrance. Without hindrance. Those 2 words at the end of Acts are sometimes read as triumphant, and there is something triumphant about them. The man who had been beaten in Philippi, stoned in Lystra, driven out of Thessalonica, arrested in Jerusalem, held for 2 years in Caesarea, shipwrecked in the Adriatic, was now in Rome, teaching and proclaiming. The empire that had tried to stop him had, through its own legal mechanisms, delivered him to the place he had wanted to go. But without hindrance also means with a guard at the door. It means in rented quarters. Not in freedom. It means in a situation whose outcome was still undecided, whose resolution was still in the hands of a court that had not yet ruled, and an emperor who had not yet paid attention. He was not free. He was not finished. He was exactly where he had always been, doing the only thing he knew how to do when he could not go where he needed to go. He was writing. Chapter 11. The Letters That Outlived Everything. Paul died in Rome. The exact year is not certain. The exact circumstances are not fully recorded in any source we can fully trust. The tradition that places his death under Nero, in the mid-60s AD, is old and widely held. But it is tradition more than it is documented history. What we know is that after Acts ends, after the 2 years of house arrest in Rome, the sources go quiet about Paul in a way that suggests his story did not continue much longer. The manner of his death, according to tradition, was beheading. As a Roman citizen, he would have been spared crucifixion. That distinction, the citizenship that had protected him in Philippi and gotten him to Rome, followed him to the end. He was somewhere in his late 50s or early 60s when he died. He had been traveling and teaching and writing and arguing for roughly 30 years since Damascus. He had walked thousands of miles. He had crossed the Aegean multiple times. He had been in more cities than most people of his era ever saw in a lifetime. He had built communities in places that would have seemed impossibly remote to the people who knew him in Jerusalem, in places where the name of Jesus had never been spoken before he arrived. And then he was gone. The communities he had built were still small. Christianity was still a minority movement inside a vast empire that had not yet decided what to do with it. The Jerusalem Temple, the center of the Jewish world that had shaped everything about Paul's formation, would be destroyed by Rome in 70 AD, just a few years after Paul's death, an event that would reshape Judaism and the Jesus movement in ways that neither Paul nor anyone else had fully anticipated. The empire that had imprisoned Paul and was now presumably going to execute him was still the most powerful institution in the world, with no obvious signs of weakening. From the outside, looking at the situation in the mid-60s AD, there was no particular reason to think that Paul's story would matter much beyond the specific communities he had built. Movements like the one he had spent his life promoting rose and fell in the Roman world with some regularity. A charismatic leader, a small group of followers, a message that attracted some people and alarmed others. And then the leader died, and the movement either consolidated around new leadership or scattered and dissolved. But the letters kept being copied. This is the thing that changed everything. And it happened so quietly and so gradually that no one would have been able to point to the moment when the small collection of Paul's correspondence became something with a life of its own. Communities that had received his letters shared them with other communities. The letter to the Romans, which Paul had sent ahead of himself to a community he had never visited, circulated widely because it was the most comprehensive statement of his thinking that he had ever produced. The Corinthian letters circulated because the problems they addressed were not unique to Corinth. Every community that read about the factions and the status games and the arguments about spiritual gifts and the failure to care for the poor recognized something of themselves. The letters were not written to be scripture. Paul was not sitting down to write documents for the canon of a new religion. He was writing urgent correspondence to specific communities about specific problems, in the way that a person writes when they cannot be present and have to make words do the work of presence. He was writing like someone who believed the end of the age was near, that Jesus would return within the lifetime of at least some of the people he was addressing, that the communities he was building were holding on until the great day arrived. The great day, in the sense Paul expected it, did not arrive. What arrived instead was generation after generation of people reading his letters and finding in them something that spoke to their situation, their questions, their struggles, even though those situations and questions and struggles were entirely different from anything Paul had addressed. The Corinthians, arguing about status and spiritual gifts, became a mirror for every community that has ever argued about the same things. The Galatians, being pressured to conform to markers of belonging they had not been asked to adopt, became a template for every argument about inclusion and exclusion that any community has ever had. Paul's account of his own weakness, his thorn in the flesh, his pleading with God for relief and being told that grace was sufficient, became a companion for everyone who has ever prayed for something and not received it. The 7 letters that scholars are most confident are genuinely Paul's: Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon are the earliest writings in the New Testament. Earlier than any of the Gospels, earlier than Acts, earlier than anything else in the collection that became the Christian Bible. This means that the first sustained theological reflection on Jesus that we have access to is Paul's reflection, written in the heat of argument, in the middle of crisis, from prison cells and rented rooms and wherever else he happened to be when he sat down to write. People sometimes say that Paul invented Christianity, as if Jesus had one message and Paul replaced it with a different one. That framing misses what actually happened. Paul inherited the story of Jesus as an enemy, encountered it as a revelation, and then spent 30 years thinking harder about its implications than anyone else of his generation. The categories he developed, grace and faith, and the body of Christ, and the new creation, did not come from nowhere. They came from a man who had been trained in the most sophisticated theological tradition of the ancient world, who had encountered something that shattered his existing framework, and who then spent 3 years in Arabia and 30 years of ministry working out what the shattering meant. He was not the only voice in early Christianity. Peter mattered. James mattered. The communities in Antioch and Alexandria and Rome that developed their own understandings of Jesus mattered. Paul did not win every argument he had. His opponents had real points. The people who pushed back on his understanding of the law and Gentile inclusion were not simply wrong. They were working with the same sources and reaching different conclusions, as serious people engaging with difficult questions often do. But Paul's letters survived in a way that the arguments of his opponents mostly did not. We have his side of the conversation. We have the framework he built. And the framework he built became the dominant framework through which Western Christianity understood itself for the better part of 2,000 years. Luther read Paul's letter to the Romans and started the Reformation. The doctrine of justification by faith, which Paul argued for in Galatians and developed in Romans, became the fault line along which Western Christianity divided in the 16th century. Augustine read Paul and developed the theology of grace that shaped medieval Christianity. Calvin built his understanding of election and predestination on Pauline foundations. The arguments about what Paul meant by faith and works and grace and law are still being had today, in academic journals and church pulpits and seminary classrooms, and in the private reading of individuals trying to figure out what they believe. The reach goes beyond Christianity in the narrow sense. When Paul wrote that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, he articulated a principle of human equality that was not fully realized in his own communities or his own time, but that entered the bloodstream of Western civilization and kept producing consequences long after anyone remembered where it came from. The abolitionists who argued against slavery in the 19th century used Paul. So did the people who defended slavery. The same texts, read with different eyes, producing different conclusions. That is what happens when an idea is genuinely powerful. It escapes the control of the person who expressed it and does things in the world that the person could not have anticipated. Paul could not have anticipated any of it. He was writing for communities that numbered in the dozens or hundreds, trying to hold together groups of people who were arguing about food and status and spiritual gifts and circumcision and what happened to the dead before the day Jesus returned. He was not writing for the ages. He was writing for Thursday. But Thursday became Friday. And Friday became the following week. And the following week became a century. And the century became 20 centuries. And the letters kept being copied and read and argued over, and translated and preached and misused and recovered and read again. He entered the story as the man who tried to stop it. He left it as one of the reasons it could not be stopped. That is not a tidy ending. It is not the story of a man who got everything right, who built something that worked exactly as he intended, who achieved the goal he set out to achieve, and died satisfied with what he had done. He did not reconcile Jerusalem and the Gentile churches in his lifetime. He did not resolve the theological disputes he had started. He did not see the empire become Christian, or the temple destroyed, or any of the large historical consequences of the forces he had helped set in motion. He just kept writing until he could not write anymore. And the writing outlasted everything else. It outlasted the temple he had been accused of defiling. It outlasted the empire that had imprisoned him and would eventually execute him. It outlasted the communities that had frustrated him and moved him and almost broken him. It outlasted the arguments that had seemed so urgent and so specific to their moment that no one could have imagined they would still matter when the moment was long past. The letters are still there, still being read, still being argued over, still doing what letters do when they are written by someone who meant every word and had nothing left to lose. Still arriving. Go back to the room. Rome, around 62 AD. The small rented space with the soldier outside the door. The man sitting at the table with a letter he is trying to finish before the light goes. He is not young anymore. The body that has been beaten and stoned and starved and shipwrecked and left for dead outside a city in Asia Minor is showing every one of those experiences now. He moves more carefully than he used to. The hands that cut leather for 30 years and wrote thousands of words in the margins of borrowed time are still moving across the page. But they are the hands of a man who has used them hard and knows it. He is writing to Timothy, a young man he has known since Timothy was a teenager in Lystra, the city where Paul was stoned and dragged outside the walls and left for dead and then got up and walked back in. Timothy has been with him for years, has been sent ahead to communities when Paul could not go himself, has carried Paul's words into rooms Paul was not allowed to enter. He is the closest thing Paul has to a son. The letter Paul is writing to him is the last one we have. 2 Timothy, as it has come to be called. Whether it was literally the last thing Paul wrote, we cannot say with certainty, but it reads like a last letter. It has the quality of words spoken by someone who is looking back and trying to say the thing that matters most before the time runs out. He tells Timothy to come to him soon. He says that Demas has deserted him because he was in love with the present world. He says that at his first offense, no one came to stand by him, that everyone deserted him, and he says he hopes it will not be charged against them. He asks Timothy to bring his cloak, the one he left with a man in Troas, and the books, and especially the parchments, the cloak, the books, the parchments. He is cold. He wants to read. He is in prison waiting for a verdict that everyone probably already knows. And he is asking for his books. And then, near the end of the letter, he writes the line that has been echoing through 2,000 years of people who have read it in the moment when they needed it most. He says, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." People tend to read those words as triumphant, as the declaration of a victor, and there is something of triumph in them, but read them slowly, in the context of the letter they appear in the context of the life that produced them, and they are something more complicated and more honest than triumph. He has fought. That means there was a fight. It was not easy. It cost something. The Greek word he uses for fight is the same word used for athletic contests and for battles. A word that implies effort and strain and the possibility of losing. He is not saying the fight was enjoyable. He is saying he did not stop fighting. He has finished the race, not won it. in the sense of leaving everyone else behind. Finished it. Crossed the line. The race is the specific race he was given to run. The one that started on a road in Syria and has been running through desert and city and courtroom and prison ever since. He ran it. He did not quit. He has kept the faith. Not built a perfect institution. Not convinced everyone. Not resolved every argument, or healed every fracture, or produced the unified Christian world he might have imagined was possible in the early years of his ministry. He kept the faith. The thing he had received, the thing he had encountered, the thing he had been carrying and arguing and writing about for 30 years. He still had it. Whatever had been taken from him, his freedom, his health, his companions, his plans, that had not been taken. This is not the language of someone who got everything he wanted. It is the language of someone who held on to the thing that mattered most, and is drawing a line under a life and saying, at minimum, that, at minimum, that. He did not know what would happen to the letters. He did not know that the small communities he had built in the cities of the Roman Empire would multiply and spread, and eventually, 3 centuries after his death, become the official religion of the empire that was about to execute him. He did not know that his letter to the Romans would sit on the desk of a monk in Germany in the 16th century and detonate a reformation that would split Western Christianity into pieces that have never fully reassembled. He did not know that his words about love from his letter to Corinth would be read at weddings in languages that did not exist yet, in countries that were not yet imagined, by people whose existence he could not have conceived. He did not know. He just kept going until he could not go anymore. He just kept writing until the letters stopped. And this is the thing about Paul, that no theological system and no historical analysis and no biography can fully contain. The question that his life keeps asking, that his letters keep asking, that the Damascus road keeps asking to anyone willing to stand on it and look down its length, is not a question about doctrine or history or the origins of Christianity. It is a simpler question and a harder one. What do you do when something breaks you open and you cannot go back to being closed? When the framework you built your life around stops working and you have to rebuild from the inside out? In the dark, without a map, using only what you have left. When the thing you were most certain about turns out to be wrong, and the thing you spent your life trying to destroy turns out to be the thing you were made to carry. What do you do? Paul's answer, given not in a single statement, but in a life, was this: you get up. You go. You write when you cannot go. You send someone else when you cannot write. You keep the faith when you have lost everything else. And you trust, with whatever you have left after everything has been taken, that the thing you are carrying is larger than you are and will outlast you in ways you cannot predict and do not need to understand. He was a persecutor who became an apostle, an enemy who became a carrier, a man who tried to stop a story and ended up being one of the reasons it could not be stopped. He was not a saint in the sense of someone who was always right and always good and always saw clearly. He was a saint in the older sense, the sense that the word carried before it became a category of perfection. Someone set apart. Someone given a task that was larger than their own preferences and comfort and agenda. Someone who, for reasons that cannot be fully explained, said yes to something and kept saying yes, long after yes had stopped being convenient. The soldier outside the door has been standing there for 2 years. The cloak has not yet arrived from Troas. The verdict has not yet come down from the emperor's court. The parchments are somewhere in a bag that needs to be brought before the cold gets worse. The man at the table is still writing. He has fought the good fight. He has finished the race. He has kept the faith. And somewhere, in a city he has never seen, in a language that does not yet exist, someone is going to read what he wrote in this room and find in it exactly what they needed to hear. He does not know that. He just writes, "That is enough. That has always been enough."